Good morning, guys. So it's about 8:30, I guess, and I decided that some of you may need a audio version of this, and there was not one on the the teacher's guide. So I'm going to go ahead and read the story to you guys. And yes, I know I look rough. I'm still in my pajamas, so you're going to have to get over that. So we're going to read from The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. It's starting on page 13. Isabel Wilkerson was born in Washington, D.C. to parents who had left the South. Their journey inspired her to investigate the Great Migration, the subject of The Warmth of Other Suns. After spending 15 years working on the book, Wilkerson published it in 2010 to immense acclaim. Already the first black woman in history of American journalism to have won a Pulitzer Prize in 1994, Wilkerson has since won more awards for her sprawling historical and journalistic work. Background: the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North was one of the largest and fastest population movements within a single country in history. Because 5 million men had left their jobs to serve in World War I, workers were in high demand, and some factories and railroads even paid for African American families to travel to the North. Everybody seems to be asleep about what is going on right under our noses. That is, everybody but those farmers who have wakened up on mornings recently to find every Negro over 21 on his place gone. To Cleveland, to Pittsburgh, to Chicago, to Indianapolis, and while our very solvency is being sucked out beneath us, we go about our affairs as usual. Editorial from the Macon Telegraph on September of 1916. Selma, Alabama, early winter 1916. No one knows who was the first to leave. It was sometime in the middle of World War I. The North faced a labor shortage and, after centuries of indifference, cast its gaze at last on the servant class of the South. The North needed workers, and the workers needed an escape. No one knows exactly when or how it commenced or who took the first actual step of what would become the Great Migration. One of the earliest references came on February 5, 1916, and was seen as an isolated, random event. It merited only a paragraph in the Chicago Defender, the agitator and unwitting chronicle of the movement, and was likely preceded by unremarked-upon departures months before. Railroads in Pennsylvania had begun undercover scouting of cheap black labor as early as 1915. But few people noticed when, in the deep of winter, with a war raging in Europe and talking of America joining in, several hundred black families began quietly departing Selma, Alabama in February 1916, declaring, according to the Chicago Defender's brief citation, that the, quote, treatment doesn't warrant staying. Ida Mae Brandon was not yet 3 years old. George Starling, Pershing Foster, and millions of others who would follow in the footsteps of those first wartime families from Selma had not yet been born, but those early departures would set the stage for their eventual migration. The families from Selma left in the midst of one of the most divisive eras in American history, the long and violent hangover after the Civil War, when the South, left to its own devices as the North looked away, dismantled the freedoms granted former slaves after the war. The plantation owners had trouble imagining the innate desires of the people they once had owned. "I find a worse state of things with the Negroes than I expected," wrote General Hal Cobb, a Georgia planter, shortly after the slaves were freed. "Let any man offer them some little thing of no real value, but which looks like a little more freedom, and they catch at it with avidity, and would sacrifice their best friends without hesitation and without regret. They'll almost starve and go naked," planted a planter in Warren County, Georgia, "before they will work for a white man if they can get a patch of ground to live on and get from under his control." For all its upheaval, the Civil War had left most blacks in the South no better off economically than they had been before sharecropping. Sharecropping, slavery's replacement, kept them in debt and still bound to whatever plantation they worked. But one thing had changed. the federal government had taken over the affairs of the South during a period known as Reconstruction, and the newly freed men were able to exercise rights previously denied them. They could vote, marry, or go to school, if there were one nearby, and the more ambitious among them could enroll in black colleges set up by Northern philanthropists, open businesses, and run for office under the protection of Northern troops. In short order, some managed to become physicians, legislators, undertakers, insurance men. They assumed that the question of black citizens' rights had been settled for good, and that all that confronted them was merely building on these new opportunities. But by the mid-1870s, when the North withdrew its oversight in the face of Southern hostility, whites in the South began to resurrect the caste system founded under slavery. Nursing the wounds of defeat and seeking a scapegoat, much like Germany in the years leading up to Nazism, they began to undo the opportunities accorded freed slaves during the Reconstruction and to refine the language of white supremacy. They would create a caste system based not on pedigree and title, as in Europe, but solely on race, and which, by law, disavowed any movement of the lowest caste system into the mainstream. The fight over this new caste system made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. Homer A. Plessy, a colored Louisianan, protested a new state law forbidding any railroad passenger from entering, quote, a compartment to which, by race, he does not belong. On June 7, 1894, Plessy bought a first-class ticket on the East Louisiana Railroad, took an empty seat in the white-only car, and was arrested when he refused to move. In 1896, in the seminal case of Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court sided with the South and ruled in an 8-1 vote that equal but separate accommodations were constitutional. That ruling would stand for the next 60 years. Now, with a new century approaching, blacks in the South, accustomed to the liberties established after the war, were hurled back in time, as if the preceding 3 decades, limited though they may have been, had never happened. One by one, each license or freedom accorded them was stripped away. The world got smaller, narrower, more confined with each new court ruling and ordinance. Not unlike European Jews who watched the world close in on them slowly. I'm going to reread that sentence. Not unlike European Jews who watched the world close in on them slowly, perhaps barely perceptibly, at the start of Nazism, colored people in the South would first react in denial and disbelief to the rising hysteria, then helpless to stop it, attempt a belated resistance, not knowing and not able to imagine how far the supremacists would go. The outcomes for both groups were widely divergent, one suffering unspeakable loss and genocide, the other enduring nearly a century of apartheid, programs, and mob executions. But the hatreds and fears that fed both assaults were not dissimilar and relied on arousing the passions of the indifferent to mount so complete an attack. The South began attacking in outright defiance of the 14th Amendment of 1868, which granted the right to due process and equal protection to anyone born in the United States, and it ignored the 15th Amendment of 1880, which guaranteed all men the right to vote. Each year, people who had been able to vote or ride the train where they chose found that something they could do freely yesterday they were prohibited from doing today. They were losing ground and sinking lower in status with each passing day. And well into the new century, the colored codes would only grow to encompass more activities of daily life as quickly as legislatures could devise them. Thus, those silent parties leaving Selma in the winter of 1916 saw no option but to go. Theirs would become the first volley of a leaderless revolution. There was no Moses or Joshua or Harriet Tubman, or for that matter, Malcolm X or Martin Luther King Jr. to organize the migration. The best-known leaders at the start were Booker T. Washington, who vehemently was against abandonment of the South and strongly discouraged it. Frederick Douglass, who saw it coming but died before it began, was against the very thought of it and considered an exodus from the South a premature, disheartening surrender. Those entreaties had little effect. The Negroes just quietly moved away without taking their recognized leaders into their confidence any more than they do the white people around them, a Labor Department study reported. A colored minister might meet with his deacons on a Wednesday, thinking all was well, and by Sunday find all the church elders gone north. They write the ministers that they forgot to tell them they were going away. Ordinary people listen to their hearts and instead of their leaders. At a clandestine meeting after a near lynching in Mississippi, a colored leader stood before the people and urged them to stay where they were. A man in the audience rose to speak up. "You tell us the South is the best place for us?" the man said. "What guarantees can you give us that our life and liberty will be safe if we stay?" The leader was speechless. "When he asked me that, there was nothing I could answer," the leader said afterward. "So I have not again urged my race to remain." Any leader who dared argue against leaving might arouse suspicion that he was a tool of the white people running things. Any such leader was, therefore, likely to be ignored, or worse. One Sunday, a colored minister in Tampa, Florida, advised the pulpit that his flock stay in the South. He was stabbed the next day for doing so. In the years leading up to and immediately following the turn of the 20th century, a generation came into the world unlike any other in the South. It was made up of young people with no personal recollection of slavery. They were 2 generations removed from it. The colored members of this generation were free but not free, chafing under Jim Crow and resisting the studied subservience of their slave parents and grandparents. They had grown up without the contrived intimacy that once bound the 2 races, and it appeared that young whites, weaned on a formal kind of supremacy, had grown more hostile to blacks than even their slaveholding ancestors had been. The sentiment is altogether different now, William C. Oakes, the old guard former governor of Alabama, said in 1901 of the newer generation of white Southerners. "When the Negro is doing no harm, the people want to kill him and wipe him from the face of the earth." The colored people of this generation began looking for a way out. It's too much to expect that Negroes will indefinitely endure their severe limitations in the South when they can escape, most of them in a ride of 36 hours, the Labor Department warned. 50 years after the Civil War, they should not be expected to be content with the same conditions which existed at the close of the war. Younger blacks could see the contradictions in their world, that 60, 70, 80 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, they still had to step off the sidewalk when a white person approached, were banished to jobs nobody else wanted no matter their skill or ambition, couldn't vote, but could be hanged on suspicion of the pettiest infraction. These were the facts of their lives. There were days when whites could go to the amusement park and a day when blacks could go, if they were permitted at all. There were white elevators and colored elevators, meaning freight elevators in the back, white train platforms and colored train platforms. There were white ambulances and colored ambulances to ferry the sick, and white hearses and colored hearses for those who didn't survive whatever was wrong with them. There were white waiting rooms and colored waiting rooms in any conceivable place where a person might have to wait for something, from the bus depot to the doctor's office. A total of 4 restrooms had to be constructed and maintained at significant expense in any public establishment that bothered to provide for colored people. 1 for white men, 1 for white women, 1 for colored men, and 1 for colored women. In 1958, a new bus station went up in Jacksonville, Florida, with 2 of everything, including 2 segregated cocktail lounges, lest the races brush elbows over a martini, the Wall Street Journal reported. The president of the Southeastern Greyhound told the Journal, quote, "It frequently cost 50% more to build a terminal with segregated facilities, but most Southern businessmen didn't dare complain about the extra cost. The question is dynamite," the president of the Southern theater chain told the Journal. "Don't even say what state I'm in." There was a colored window at the post office in Pensacola, Florida, and there were white and colored telephone booths in Oklahoma, while white and colored went to separate windows to get their license plate in Indianola, Mississippi, and to separate tellers to make their deposits at the First National Bank of Atlanta. There were taxi cabs for colored people and taxi cabs for white people in Jacksonville, Birmingham, Atlanta, and the entire state of Mississippi. Colored people had to be off the streets and out of the city limits by 8 p.m. in Palm Beach and Miami Beach. Throughout the South, the conventional rules of the road did not apply when a colored motorist was behind the wheel. If he reached an intersection first, he had to let the white motorist go ahead of him. He could not pass a white motorist on the road no matter how slowly the white motorist was going, and had to take extreme caution to avoid an accident, because he would likely be blamed no matter who was at fault. In everyday interactions, a black person could not contradict a white person or speak unless spoken to first. A black person could not be the first to offer to shake a white person's hand. A handshake could only occur if a white person so gestured, leaving many people having never shaken hands with a person of another race. The consequences for the slightest misstep were swift and brutal. 2 whites beat a black tenant farmer in Louise, Mississippi in 1948, wrote the historian James C. Cobb, because the man, quote, asked for a receipt after paying his water bill. It was against the law for a colored person and a white person to play checkers together in Birmingham. White and colored gamblers had to place their bets at separate windows and sit in separate aisles at the racetrack in Arkansas. At saloons in Atlanta, the bars were segregated. Whites drank on stools at one end of the bar and blacks on stools at the other end, until the city outlawed even that, resulting in white-only and colored-only saloons. There were white parking spaces and colored parking spaces in the town square in Calhoun City, Mississippi. In one North Carolina courthouse, there was a white Bible and a black Bible to swear to tell the truth on. These were the facts of their lives, of Ida Mae's, George's, and Pershing's existence before they left, carried out with soul-killing efficiency until Jim Crow expired under the weight of the South's own sectarian violence, bombings, hosings of children, and the killing of dissidents seeking basic human rights. Jim Crow would not get a proper burial until the enactment of federal legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was nonetheless resisted years after its passage as vigorously as Reconstruction had been, and would not fully take hold in many parts of the South until well into the 1970s. And so, what started as a little-noticed march of the impatient would become a flood of the discontented during World War II, and by the tail end of the migration, a virtual rite of passage for the young Southerners, brothers joining brothers, nieces joining aunts, and soon as they got big enough to go. Many of the people who left the South never exactly sat their children down to tell them these things, tell them what happened and why they left, and how they and all his blood kin came to be in the northern city or western suburb, or why they speak like melted butter, and their children speak like footsteps on pavement, prim and proper, or clipped and fast like the New World itself. Some spoke of specific and certain evils. Some lived in tight-lipped and cheerful denial. Others simply had no desire to relive what they had already left. The facts of their lives unfurled over the generations like an overwrapped present, a secret told in syllables. Sometimes the migrants dropped puzzle pieces from the past while folding the laundry or stirring the cornbread, and the children would listen between cereal commercials and not truly understand until they grew up and had children and troubles of their own. And the ones who had half listened would scold and kick themselves that they had not paid better attention when they had the chance. And in this way, the ways of the South passed from one generation to the next in faraway cities, by the Pacific Ocean and on the shores of the Great Lakes, and along the Hudson and the Potomac and the Allegheny rivers. These are the stories of the forgotten, aggrieved, wishful generations between the Harlem Renaissance and the Civil Rights Movement, whose private ambition for something better made a way for those who followed.